At least Blessing knows how to sit and eat Mama's food like a normal person, Ngozi.
Emeka, do you know whose money bought that food?
What kind of question is that?
Mine. Every single time. The gas, the rice, the beef in Bingo's bowl sits, all of it. Me.
Ngozi, don't do this. Not in front of guests. 8 months, Mama. 8 months I paid for this house while eating garri at that counter.
8 months of transfers into Emeka's account that everyone called a blessing from God.
What are you saying?
I'm saying read this. Every payment, every transfer, every receipt, it's all in here. Every date, every amount, everything this house consumed while I stood at that counter and watched Bingo eat better than me.
I'm not angry. I just stopped being hungry for this table a long time ago.
Ngozi grew up in Nsukka with flour on her hands and numbers in her head. Her mother sold vegetables. Her father drove a taxi when the engine cooperated and walked when it didn't. They were not poor enough to make the news, but poor enough that Ngozi learned early that nothing in this life arrives without someone working for it. What she had, what no circumstance had given her, and none could take away, was a gift for baking. By 19, she was known in her neighborhood for birthday cakes that made grown women cry. By 22, she had a rented stall at Ogige Market, shared with a provision seller and a waiting list for wedding cakes that stretched 2 months ahead. By 24, she kept a notebook, the first of many where she tracked orders, ingredients, and a growing pile of savings earmarked for something larger. A real bakery, a shop with her name above the door. That was the life Ngozi had built for herself when Emeka Okoro walked into it on a Friday afternoon, sent by his mother to buy palm oil and distracted immediately and completely by the smell of fresh chin-chin. He came back the following Friday, and the next. By the third visit, he had stopped pretending the palm oil was the reason. Emeka was, by every visible measure, a good man, quiet, steady, an accountant with a neat appearance and a genuine laugh. What made Ngozi fall for him was not grand gestures, but small ones, the way he asked about her bakery dream not once but twice, and listened both times like the answer actually mattered. Nobody had ever asked twice before. What nobody explained to a 24-year-old woman falling in love for the first time was this: you do not simply marry a man, you marry everything that shaped him. And what had shaped Emeka, more than school, more than work, more than anything else across 30 years of living, was his mother. Mama Chika had buried her husband when Emeka was 8 years old. She had sold the family land, worked 2 jobs, and raised her only son until he became the first in the family to finish university. Every word of that is true. The sacrifice was real, and the love behind it was real, and nobody who knew her story could call it anything less than extraordinary. But sometimes, the people who give everything to raise a child make, somewhere beneath all that love, a quiet decision they never put into words that the child, having cost so much, belongs to them in a way that doesn't end when the child grows up. When Emeka brought Ngozi home for the first time, Mama Chika smiled through the entire visit. She complimented Ngozi's dress, asked about her family, said more than once that Emeka had told her so much about her. Everything she said was warm. Everything she said was correct. And yet, Ngozi left that afternoon with a feeling she could not name, not unfriendliness, nothing so simple as that, but something underneath the warmth, like a floor that looked solid but gave slightly under pressure. She told her best friend about it that evening. Her friend laughed and said she was overthinking. Ngozi laughed too and let it go, because she was in love, and Emeka held her hand the whole drive home and told her his mother liked her very much, that everything was fine, that she had nothing to worry about. He believed every word of it. And that, more than anything Mama Chica ever said or did, was where the real problem lived. The wedding was beautiful. 3 months later, Ngozi moved into the house on Eke Street. Just for a year or two, everyone agreed, just until they saved enough for their own place. In that house, on the first evening, Mama Chica showed Ngozi the kitchen, her kitchen, 30 years of it, and explained, warmly and without a single unkind word, that she had a system, and the system worked, and Ngozi was welcome to help, but the kitchen itself was hers. It seemed reasonable. It was, after all, Mama Chica's house. Ngozi nodded and said, of course, Mama, whatever you prefer. And somewhere in the walls of that kitchen, quiet as a door closing in another room, the first rule wrote itself. The rules of that house were never written down. They did not need to be. They arrived the way cold arrives in a room when a window is left open gradually, then all at once, until you could no longer remember what warmth had felt like. The first rule was the bowl. Bingo had lived on Eke Street for 15 years, inherited from Emeka's late father, and in that time had become less a dog and more a habit, something Mama Chica fed every evening with the same automatic devotion she gave to lighting the stove or locking the gate. Every night, before anyone else was served, before the plates came out, Mama Chica scraped a portion from the pot into Bingo's bowl. A good portion, the kind with actual meat, properly cut, still steaming. Nobody questioned this. It was simply how things were done. And because nobody questioned it, nobody noticed at first that the portion going into Bingo's bowl was consistently larger than the one ending up on Ngozi's plate. It was not done loudly. It was never done with any visible intention. Mama Chica served with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding a household for decades. Bingo first, then Emeka, then herself, then Ngozi, by which point the pot was always somehow slightly diminished, the meat always slightly fewer, the broth always slightly thinner. And if Ngozi's portion was smaller, well, she was the newest person at that table. These things took adjustment. Nobody said it out loud. It simply was. The second rule was the kitchen itself. In her third week, missing her old life more than she allowed herself to admit, Ngozi spent an afternoon baking chin-chin, the same recipe that had once built her a 2-month waiting list in Nsukka. She asked permission first, received it warmly, and spent 3 hours producing something she was quietly proud of. She packed a container for Emeka's office, set some aside for the house, and was washing up when Mama Chica appeared, looked at the container, and went still in that particular way that was not anger and not disapproval, but something that preceded both. She said the chin-chin was good. She said it slowly, the way people say things they are about to qualify. Then she said that people would ask questions. Why was her daughter-in-law making things to sell when her husband already provided? It didn't look right. People would talk. Ngozi explained it was not for selling, only for Emeka's office. A small gift. Mama Chica said she understood. She just wanted Ngozi to be careful. That was all. They didn't want people forming wrong impressions about this house. The container sat untouched on the counter through dinner and into the next morning. Then it disappeared, not thrown away, because Mama Chica never wasted food but relocated to the shelf near Bingo's leash. Over the following days, chin-chin appeared in Bingo's evening bowl, crumbled over his meat like garnish. Ngozi watched this happen and said nothing, because what was there to say about chin-chin and a dog when there were so many larger things she was also not saying? The third rule arrived on a night Emeka was away for work. Mama Chica cooked beef stew, the proper kind, simmered since afternoon, the smell of it filling every room. At dinner, she served Bingo first, 2 generous pieces of meat, because he had been alone in the yard all day. Then she looked into the pot and told Ngozi, lightly, apologetically, the way someone mentions running out of sugar, that there wasn't much meat left. She hadn't known Emeka would be away. She'd cooked for 3, but there was extra garri. Ngozi should soak some. It would fill her up. There was meat left in that pot. Not much, but some. Ngozi saw it clearly from where she stood. She soaked the garri at the counter, standing, because the dining table only had 2 chairs pulled out, and Mama Chica was already seated in one and ate it slowly, while Mama Chica talked about a woman from church whose son had just gotten engaged. Wasn't that wonderful? And from the yard came the sound of Bingo's tail thumping contentedly against the wooden post as he finished his bowl. Ngozi said yes, it was wonderful. She rinsed her cup when she was done. She went to bed. She told herself it was garri. It was one night. These were such small things. And they were small things. That was precisely how they worked. 3 years passed, the way water wears down stone, not in any single moment anyone could point to, but in thousands of small repetitions, each one too minor to fight, each one building on the last, until the shape of something had changed completely without anyone deciding it should. The garri became simply how things were. Ngozi stopped counting portions the way you stop noticing a scar, not because it healed, but because the eye adjusts. Bingo grew fat and slow. The chin never appeared in that kitchen again. The notebook where Ngozi had once tracked wedding cake orders sat in the bottom of a drawer, unopened, still smelling faintly of vanilla from a life 3 years and 1 town away. Emeka worked, came home tired, ate whatever was put in front of him, and complimented his mother's cooking the way he had every evening of his entire life. He loved his wife. He simply never thought to ask what she had eaten, because it had genuinely never occurred to him that her answer might be different from his own. Mama Chica settled into something that felt, to her, like order restored. The house ran as it always had. Her son was home and content. The new wife, and after 3 years, Ngozi was still, in some unspoken way, the new wife had not caused trouble, had not raised her voice, had given no visible reason for concern, and yet, there were small moments Ngozi would later return to, not because they had seemed important at the time, but because they were the first faint outlines of something taking shape beneath the surface. There was the afternoon a neighbor stopped her at the gate and asked, almost in passing, whether she still baked. She had heard something once about a market stall. Chin, wasn't it? Ngozi said no, not anymore, and changed the subject. But that night, she lay awake thinking about the question far longer than it deserved. There was the Sunday Mama Chica hosted the church women, and the table that day was full proper meat, jollof rice, small chops because guests were coming, and guests, unlike daughters-in-law, were always served first and served well. Ngozi spent the afternoon cooking food she would eat little of, receiving compliments she would not be credited for. And there was the phone call, late in the 3rd year, from an old friend in Nsukka. Her cousin was getting married. She needed a cake, a big one. Did Ngozi still bake? Ngozi sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, looking at Mama Chica's kitchen around her, its rules, its rhythms, its 30 years of certainty, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, not sadness, hunger, the real kind. Ngozi said yes to the cake 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when Mama Chica was at a funeral 2 towns away, and the house belonged, for a few quiet hours, to no one but herself. She did not bake it in that kitchen. There was no version of events in which 3 tiers of cake batter cooling on Mama Chica's counters, mixing bowls stacked in Mama Chica's sink, the whole house smelling of butter and vanilla for an entire afternoon, could exist without becoming, by evening, a conversation. And Ngozi had spent 3 years learning to recognize the shape of a conversation before it arrived. So she called Mrs. Adeyemi instead, the neighbor 2 houses down, who had asked about the chin at the gate, who had an oven sitting mostly unused since her children grew up and moved away, who lit up at the question the way people do when they are asked to be part of something rather than simply asked for something. For 6 weeks, Ngozi lived 2 lives, though she would not have described it that way because nothing about it felt dramatic. In the mornings, she was exactly who she had been for 3 years up at 6. Breakfast at the family table, the same plate, the same portion, the same conversation about whichever neighbor's relative had just done something worth discussing. In the afternoons, 2 or 3 days a week, she told Mama Chika she was visiting a friend down the street, which was true, technically, in the way small true things can sit on top of larger true things without either one being quite a lie. At Mrs. Adeyemi's, in a kitchen that smelled nothing like the one on Eke Street, Ngozi baked. Her hands remembered the recipes before her mind fully did, the way a body remembers something the mind has tried to forget. The first tear came out slightly uneven. The second was better. By the third, something in her chest had loosened that she hadn't realized was tight, a feeling she couldn't name until much later when she finally found the word for it. She felt like herself. The cake was beautiful. 3 tiers, white and gold, sugar flowers piped 1 petal at a time on a Tuesday afternoon while Mrs. Adeyemi made tea and asked gentle questions that Ngozi found herself, for the first time in years, almost answering honestly. The bride's family paid well. Ngozi held the money on the walk home that evening and felt something she had not felt since Nusuka, the specific quiet weight of earnings that belonged entirely to her that no one else in the world yet knew existed. She opened a savings account the following week at a bank 2 streets from Mrs. Adeyemi's house. She put the cake money in it. She bought a new notebook, the same kind she had always kept, the habit too deep to break, and wrote down the date, the order, the amount, in the careful handwriting of someone tracking something precious. The second order came 2 weeks later, the third before the second was finished. Within 2 months, she was baking most weeks, sometimes twice, birthday cakes and trays of small chops for engagement parties, the kind of orders that could be collected quietly from Mrs. Adeyemi's gate without anyone asking too many questions. Nobody on Eke Street noticed anything different because nothing about Ngozi's daily life on Eke Street had changed. She still woke at 6. She still ate whatever portion landed on her plate. She still said yes, Mama, how wonderful, when told about another neighbor's good fortune. The only thing that had changed existed somewhere else entirely, in a kitchen 2 streets away, in a notebook in the bottom of a bag, in a bank account whose balance was growing, slowly and steadily, into something that would eventually become impossible to ignore. One evening, Emeka came home with news of a small work bonus, smiling, mentioning it twice at dinner, saying maybe he would use it to fix the leaking bathroom ceiling. Ngozi, sitting at the counter with her garri, almost said it then, almost said she had money too, that she had been baking again, that there was an account he didn't know about. Then Mama Chika patted her son's hand and said this was what happened when a man worked hard without distraction. God blessed steady hands. Ngozi swallowed the words with her garri. The moment passed. But unlike most moments in that house, this one she would remember clearly for a long time as the exact point where the silence stopped being an accident and became, quietly and deliberately, a choice. It was the lunches that gave it away, not the bank account, not the notebook, not anything Ngozi had been careful to protect. Something far smaller. A plastic container of food, packed the night before, carried out of the house on the mornings she went to Mrs. Adeyemi's. It was practical. Baking took hours. A person could not work for hours on an empty stomach, and walking home for lunch wasted time she didn't have. So she began packing whatever was left from the previous night's dinner, the same portion she would have eaten at the counter anyway, just eaten 2 streets away instead. To Ngozi, it was the smallest possible adjustment. To Mama Chika, it was a declaration. She noticed within the first week the way she noticed everything in that house, not by asking directly, but by mentioning it sideways, in a tone so light it could be mistaken for nothing at all. A comment here, a small sigh there, the particular brand of observation that sounded like concern but functioned like a report being filed. By the following Sunday, the women at church had heard that Mama Chika's daughter-in-law had stopped eating with the family, that she packed her own food now and went her own way. That Mama Chika didn't take it personally. Of course, she was not that kind of woman, but it was noticed and it was felt, and what could she do but pray? The church women made sympathetic sounds. Mrs. Obi, who lived 3 streets away and had strong feelings about the behavior of daughters-in-law in general, nodded with particular feeling. The conversation moved, as such conversations always did, into a warm and satisfying discussion of how things had been better in the days when young women understood their place in a home. None of this reached Ngozi directly. That was, in its way, the most effective part of it. She continued baking, continued packing her container, continued coming home in the evenings carrying a tiredness that felt, for the first time in years, like it belonged to her. She noticed nothing different in the house. Mama Chika was, if anything, slightly warmer than usual. It was Emeka who eventually heard it from his uncle at a family gathering, who mentioned it the way men mention things absorbed from their wives, who heard it from women at church, who heard it from Mama Chika, the uncle asked, with the specific casualness of a man about to say something that is not casual at all, whether everything was all right at home. He had heard Ngozi no longer ate with her mother-in-law, carried her own food around like a stranger in the house. Emeka laughed it off in the moment, but the comment traveled home with him and arrived heavier than it had left. He raised it 3 nights later, standing in the bedroom doorway, while Ngozi sat on the edge of the bed, tired from a long day at Mrs. Adeyemi's that nobody in the house knew about. He did not sit beside her. He stood with his arms crossed in a way she had rarely seen from him, and told her what his uncle had said, what people were noticing, what it looked like from the outside, his mother, in her own house, and her daughter-in-law behaving as though she could not stand to be near her. Ngozi looked at him and said nothing for a moment. There were many things she could have said. She could have said she had offered to help in that kitchen for 3 years and been turned away every time. She could have said her portion had been smaller than the dog's for so long she had stopped expecting anything different. She could have said that the friend she visited every afternoon was a woman named Mrs. Adeyemi, and that the reason she went there was that she had quietly rebuilt the business she'd had before she ever met him, and that the money she was making from it had begun, in small and careful ways, to hold this household together from underneath. She said none of it. She said she would try to eat with Mama more. She hadn't realized it looked that way. Emeka's shoulders relaxed. He kissed the top of her head, the same gesture he had used 100 times before, meant kindly, landing this time like something else entirely, and went downstairs to tell his mother, gently, that he had spoken to Ngozi, that things would be better now. Mama Chika thanked him. Said she hadn't wanted to make a fuss. Said she only wanted peace in her own home. That was all. Was that too much to ask? Upstairs, alone, Ngozi sat without moving for a long time. Below her, faintly, she heard the familiar sound of Bingo's bowl being filled for the evening, the scrape of the spoon against the pot, the soft, satisfied sound of something that had never once, in 15 years, been asked to go without. Ngozi did try to eat at the table more often for a while. She sat through dinners she had not cooked, ate portions she had not chosen, made conversation about people she had never met. It cost her nothing extra, she told herself. It bought a kind of peace, the surface kind, the kind that keeps a house quiet as long as nobody looks too closely at what is underneath. But Mrs. Adeyemi's kitchen did not stop. The orders kept coming. The way good work always finds its way to more good work. One wedding cake became a photograph. The photograph became a recommendation. The recommendation became a phone call from 2 towns away. Within 6 months, Ngozi was no longer filling small requests from a borrowed oven. She had negotiated a permanent arrangement with Mrs. Adeyemi, brought in a part-time helper for the busiest weeks, and was delivering cakes to events she would never attend, carried by people who knew her only as the woman Mrs. Adeyemi works with. A description she had never corrected because it kept her name comfortably separate from the house on Eke Street. The notebook filled. She bought a second before the first was done. The bank account grew in a way that had stopped feeling like pocket money and started feeling like something with weight and consequence. It was around this time that Ngozi began, for the first time, to pay attention to where the household money actually went. She had never tracked it before. For 3 years, it had simply existed somewhere above her Emeka's salary going in, bills going out, the household running the way it always had without her needing to understand the mechanics. But now, with her own account and her own habit of writing things down, she found herself doing arithmetic she had never done before. The numbers did not add up. Emeka's salary, which she had glimpsed on a misplaced bank statement, was smaller than the amount of money that seemed to move through that house every month. The gas that never ran out, the rice sack that never quite emptied, the beef in Bingo's bowl every single evening without exception, year after year, regardless of what was on anyone else's plate. She said nothing about this discovery. What she did instead was something quieter and more deliberate. It started with a gas cylinder that ran empty on a Tuesday. Ngozi, passing the supplier on her way home from a delivery, stopped and paid for a refill out of her own pocket and had it sent to the house before anyone had finished complaining about the empty one. Nobody asked where it came from. Why would they? Gas cylinders got refilled. That was simply how things worked. The following month it was the rice. Then the beef, same cut, same weight, same extra portion for Bingo, ordered from Mr. Okeke before Mama Chika even reached the market. Paid for with cake money, recorded in the notebook with the same careful handwriting she used for everything that mattered. Mama Chika told Emeka one evening that God was blessing the house lately. Things seemed to stretch further than they used to. Emeka agreed that God was good. Ngozi, at the counter with her garri, said nothing. She simply wrote it down. Blessing arrived the way Mama Chika arranged most things she had already decided about, warmly, gradually, and without leaving room for discussion. She was the daughter of a woman from the church group, 23 years old, recently arrived in town to stay with relatives while she looked for work. Mama Chika had met her at a vigil, found her respectful and well-raised, and within 2 conversations had begun inviting her to the house. First for tea, then for Sunday lunch, then for no occasion at all. Nobody used the word everyone understood. What was said instead was that Blessing was good company, that it was nice to have someone around who appreciated things, that she reminded Mama Chika of herself at that age. These sentences were said in front of Ngozi, warmly, without any acknowledgement that they might land as anything other than warm. What made it unbearable was not Blessing herself. Blessing was exactly what she appeared to be, a polite young woman, grateful for kindness, eager to be useful. She offered to help in the kitchen, and Mama Chika said yes, come, let me show you, the way she had never once said to Ngozi in 3 years. Within weeks, Blessing knew where everything went. She sat at the table without being asked. She ate whatever was served and said it was delicious and meant it, the way someone means things when they have not yet learned that the warmth being offered to them was built on someone else's diminishment. The dinners changed. There was more laughter now, more conversation, more food on the table, and more people visibly enjoying it. Emeka seemed lighter. Mama Chika seemed satisfied in a way that went beyond the ordinary satisfaction of a good meal. Ngozi, on the evenings she was home, sat at the end of the table and ate what was in front of her and said little. On the evenings she was not home, which were more frequent now. As the business grew, she returned to find the table already cleared, and the three of them settled in the parlor like a complete arrangement, one that appeared to be missing nothing. It was a Friday evening when it happened. Mama Chika had invited the church women. The good plates were out, the tablecloth from the wedding, beef stew that had been simmering since morning. Blessing sat beside Mama Chika. Emeka sat across from them. Ngozi sat at the end, her plate in front of her, mostly rice and broth, the same as always. Mrs. Obi, raising her glass toward Blessing, said she was a real blessing to the house, always present, always eating with the family. Some people never quite learned how to do that. Emeka glanced at Ngozi and said, without thinking, without malice, without any understanding of what he was about to detonate, that at least Blessing knew how to sit and eat Mama's food like a normal person. The rest is already written at the beginning of this story. The spoon set down, the notebook placed on the table, the door closing behind a woman who had already, months ago, made every preparation she needed to make. What nobody in that room fully understood, watching her go, was that Ngozi had not left in anger. She had left in completion. The notebook on the table was not a weapon. It was a receipt 3 years of a household fed and held together by hands nobody had thought to thank, now returned to the people who had eaten from them without ever once asking whose they were. Beneath the table, Bingo finished the last of his beef. His tail moved once, twice, then stilled. The most contented soul in that room, and the only one with nothing to answer for. Nobody slept well on Eke Street that night. The notebook stayed on the table until almost midnight. It was Mama Chika who finally picked it up, not to dispute it, not to dismiss it, but with the careful hands of a woman handling something she did not fully understand yet. When she opened it and began to read, date after date, amount after amount, the expression on her face moved through several things before settling on the one nobody expected. Not anger, not denial, recognition. The slow, sinking recognition of a person realizing that the story they had been telling themselves and telling others, at church, over tea, in sympathetic whispers about a daughter-in-law who didn't know her place, had quietly stopped being true a long time ago, and they had simply never noticed. Emeka did not sleep at all. He sat in the kitchen, in the chair Ngozi had always stood beside, and looked at the counter where his wife had eaten most of her meals for 3 years, while he sat 4 feet away and never once thought to ask whether she had enough. The arithmetic of it, how simple it was, how visible it would have been if he had simply looked, kept him awake until the birds started outside. He went to Mrs. Adeyemi's the next morning. He did not bring apologies rehearsed in advance. He brought the notebook and asked quietly whether Ngozi would be willing to show him the bakery. Not to talk, not to argue, just to see it. He wanted to see what she had built while he wasn't looking. Ngozi looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. What followed did not happen quickly, and this story will not pretend that it did. Some things, once said, cannot simply be unsaid, and some houses, once their unspoken rules are exposed in daylight, cannot return to running quietly in the dark. But something real began in that doorway, imperfect, uneven, and overdue. 6 months later, Ngozi opened her shop, small but real, her name above the door. Emeka helped her hang the sign. Mama Chika came to the opening and stood near the back, saying nothing, staying the whole afternoon, which was, for a woman who had never once in her life admitted she was wrong, the closest thing to an apology she knew how to give. Bingo still gets fed every evening. He is old now, slower, content in the way of creatures who have never been asked to be anything other than what they are. Nobody in that house ever considered taking that away from him. He was never the problem. He had only ever eaten what was placed in front of him. The question this story asks is not about a dog and a bowl. It is about every person who sat at that table for 3 years, watched what was placed in front of someone else, and said nothing. Here is what this story is really about. A person can disappear from their own life, one small portion at a time, while everyone around them, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, out of comfort, out of simply never having to wonder, fails to notice they are gone. And when that person finally stops disappearing quietly, what they leave behind is not a wound, it is a mirror. And sometimes, a mirror is the most devastating thing you can place on a table in front of people who have spent years looking everywhere else. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment and tell me what was the moment that hit you hardest. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe to Tales by Adais now. New stories every week. I will see you in the next one.